He hadn't spoken to a woman in 4 years. Not really spoken, not the kind that costs something. Everyone in Harlan County knew it, and everyone had stopped trying to change it. Tate Morrow had buried his wife in the spring of 2019, sold off 200 acres of the family ranch by fall, and by the following winter had made himself into a man so shut away from ordinary human warmth that his nearest neighbor, a woman named Bet Finch who baked pie for every funeral in the county, had stopped leaving food at his gate. Not because she stopped caring, because he returned the dishes empty and unsigned, like a man who'd decided that even gratitude was a door worth keeping closed. He ran 900 acres in eastern Montana on pure efficiency and stubbornness. Good cattle, good horses. A crew of 8 men who had learned to speak to him in precise, practical sentences and ask nothing personal. The kind of men who understood that what he needed from them was their labor, not their company. The county had tried, in its quiet way. There had been the widow Halverson, whose daughter had driven her out to the Morrow place, on a thin excuse about a stray heifer. There had been the new school teacher the previous spring, young, optimistic, with a casserole and a church bulletin, who had knocked on his door and received so short and final a conversation that she told her roommate afterward she felt as though she'd knocked on the door of a building that wasn't open yet and might never be. There had been others. None of them got past the porch. Tate was not cruel. He was not rude, exactly. He was simply absent in a way that had nothing to do with being present in the room. This was the situation on the 14th of October, when a woman named Phoebe Crane pulled her truck up to his gate with a flat rear tire, a loaded cargo bed, and the particular expression of someone who has passed the point of surprise at things going wrong and arrived at a kind of flat, functional resignation. She didn't call out. She didn't honk. She got out of the truck, assessed the tire, assessed the distance to the nearest town, and stood there for a moment doing quiet arithmetic about her options. Then she walked to the gate and knocked on it like it was a door. Tate saw her from the barn. He watched her knock on a gate. He'd never seen someone knock on a gate. He walked out. "Flat tire," she said when he got close enough. "Back right. I've got a spare, but the jack I borrowed is the wrong size for the frame." She said it the way a person reports weather, factual, not asking for sympathy. "Is there any chance you have a 2.5-ton floor jack I could borrow for 20 minutes? He looked at her. She looked back. She was somewhere in her late 20s, maybe 30. Dusty from the road. Her hair was pulled back in the kind of way that suggested she'd done it fast and not thought about it since. She was not dressed to impress anyone. She was dressed to drive a long distance with something heavy in the back of a truck. "What's in the bed?" he said. She glanced back. "Beekeeping equipment. 4 hive boxes, 2 supers, extractor, 200 pounds of feed sugar, and my grandmother's rocking chair because I couldn't leave it." A pause. "It's a lot to move if the truck goes anywhere." He looked at the truck, looked at her. "I'll get the jack," he said. Her name's Phoebe Crane, and she was moving to a piece of land 12 miles north that had belonged to her grandfather until 6 months ago, and had been left to her in a will that surprised everyone, including her. She'd been teaching high school biology in Missoula. She'd given notice in September, loaded everything she owned into the truck, and was making the move in the way she apparently made most decisions, practically, without a great deal of ceremony, dealing with each obstacle as it arrived. She told him none of this while he changed the tire. He didn't ask. But Bert, his youngest hand, who had a gift for extracting information from strangers that bordered on professional, had the whole story out of her in the 10 minutes it took Tate to retrieve the jack from the equipment shed. Tate crouched beside the rear axle, and she crouched on the other side and handed him things when he needed them without being asked, which meant she knew how a tire change worked, which he noted without comment. "Thank you," she said when it was done. She meant it simply. No performance of gratitude, no extending the moment. She stood up and dusted off her hands. "Where are you headed after 12 miles north?" he said. She looked at him. The question surprised her slightly, he could see that. "That's where I'm going," she said. "The Crane homestead. I'm staying." He nodded once. She loaded the bad tire into the bed and drove away. He watched her go. He went back to the barn. Bert found a reason to mention her twice before supper. Tate didn't respond either time, which Bert recorded mentally as significant, because usually Tate didn't respond once. She came back 3 weeks later. Not because of the tire. She'd gotten her well pump running with the help of a YouTube video and a borrowed pipe wrench, had set up her first 4 hives in a south-facing shelter belt, and had introduced herself to every one of her actual neighbors in the correct geographical order, which meant Tate was last because he was the most distant, as 3 separate people had warned her with variations of the same careful tone, the most complicated. She came to return the jack. He was in the paddock when she pulled in. She held up the jack when he looked over. "I tried to clean off the grease," she said. "I think I got most of it." He walked over and took it. The grease was gone. She'd done a thorough job. "You didn't have to clean it," he said. "You lent it to me," she said. "It comes back better than it left, that's the rule." He looked at her. She looked at him with the particular patience of a woman who was not waiting for anything specific and therefore could not be made to feel like she was taking too long. "Your bees settle in?" he said. He didn't know why he said it. She brightened slightly. "Not dramatically. Just a small adjustment, the way a lamp gets brighter when someone adds a little more voltage. Better than I expected. 2 of the 4 colonies are already orienting. It's late in the season, but if the weather holds another few weeks, they should be fine." She paused. "Do you know anything about bees?" "No," he said. "Most people don't," she said without condescension. "They're less mysterious than they seem. More practical." He stood there, holding the jack, and could not immediately locate a reason to end the conversation. This was unusual. He was generally very good at ending conversations. "There's coffee," he said. He said it before he decided to. She considered this for a moment. She was not eager about it, not angling for an invitation. She was genuinely deciding whether she had time. "Sure," she said. "Thank you." The kitchen was clean and spare. She sat at the table and looked around the way people do when they're reading a room. Not being nosy, just taking in information. He poured 2 cups and set one in front of her and sat across. She didn't fill the silence with noise. That was the first thing he noticed. Most people, in a quiet room with a man they didn't know well, would have found something to say about the weather, or the drive, or the coffee. Phoebe Crane sat with her cup and looked out the window at the paddock and seemed entirely comfortable with the fact that they were 2 people who didn't yet know each other, sitting in a kitchen, drinking coffee. He found himself speaking first. "How long has the Crane place been empty?" 11 years, she said. "My grandfather stopped ranching when his back gave out, leased the grazing to a neighbor, and lived in town until he died." She turned her coffee cup once. "The house needs work, the well needed work. The outbuildings need more work than I've gotten to yet." "You're doing it yourself?" "Mostly. I'll hire out what I can't figure." "What can't you figure?" She thought about it seriously, which he didn't expect. Most people answered that kind of question reflexively. "The electrical panel," she said, "and the back wall of the barn, which has a load-bearing situation I don't fully trust my own read on. Everything else I can learn." "You're not a rancher," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm a beekeeper who used to teach school." A pause. "I'll figure out the rest." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside, one of the horses moved in the paddock and made a soft sound, and the wind came off the hills in the particular way it did in October, carrying the smell of dry grass and something cooler underneath. "What do you teach?" he said. "Biology, high school." She glanced at him. "I taught." "Past tense. Why'd you stop?" She was quiet for a moment. Long enough that he understood there was a real answer behind the question, and she was deciding whether the room was the right place for it. "The right answer," she said, "is that I inherited land I didn't expect and decided to do something different with my life." She looked at her cup. "The longer answer is that I'd been doing the safe thing for a long time, and the safe thing had stopped feeling like living." She said it without drama, like a person reading a fact off a page. "My grandfather used to say that you could make a good case for almost any decision if you picked the right facts to include. I'd been picking the safe facts for a while. I thought it was time to pick a different set." He looked at her. She looked back. She wasn't asking him to respond. She wasn't looking for a reaction. She'd said it because it was true, and it was the answer to the question he'd asked. And she appeared to operate on the principle that questions deserved real answers. He drove her back to his truck after the coffee and watched her pull out down the gravel road, and then he stood there longer than the situation required. Bert, who had been pretending to fix a fence latch nearby, said nothing. He went back to work. But that evening he mentioned to the other hands that the woman from the Crane place had come by, and something in the way he said it made all 3 of them pay attention without quite knowing why. The thing about Phoebe Crane was that she never came when she needed something she could solve herself. He figured this out over the following weeks. She came 3 times in November. Once with a question about a particular section of fence line that shared a border with his property and whether the existing marker posts were the original survey stakes. Once to ask if he knew who serviced the propane systems in the county, since her tank had an irregular pressure reading. Once to let him know she'd found a section of shared drainage ditch partially blocked, and she'd cleared her half and wanted to know if he wanted to handle his half, or if she should take care of the whole length, and he could offset the labor some other way. Practical reasons. Real reasons. Never invented ones. But the conversations always ran longer than the reasons required. And neither of them remarked on this, and she never angled to extend them, and he never ended them quickly. And by December he had begun doing a thing he didn't consciously notice at first, watching the road from the kitchen window in the mornings in a way he hadn't done in 4 years. His foreman, a quiet man of 53 named Del Stokes, noticed it in the 3rd week of November. Del was not a man who commented on personal matters. He had worked for Tate Morrow for 7 years, and had navigated the death of Tate's wife and the 2 years of frostbitten grief that followed with the particular skill of a man who understood that some silences were not meant to be broken, only kept company. But on a Tuesday afternoon, driving back from the South Range, Del said without preamble, "The beekeeper. What about HUD?" Just said. They drove the rest of the way in silence. Tate didn't explain, because there was nothing to explain, because nothing had happened, which was true. But the nothing that had happened had a different quality than the nothing that had been happening for 4 years, and Del Stokes, who had been driving with this man across this land for 7 years, could tell the difference with his eyes closed. In the 2nd week of December, Phoebe Crane lost 2 hives. She came to Tate's gate on a morning so cold the gravel rang underfoot, and when he saw her face, he knew something had gone wrong before she said anything. Not devastated. She wasn't a woman who did public devastation, but there was something around her eyes that was careful in a way it usually wasn't. "I need to talk through what happened," she said. "If you have 20 minutes, I don't need help, I just..." She stopped, started again. "My neighbor to the north said it was my fault, that I set up too late in the season, and everyone told me so." A pause. "I need to talk to someone who won't tell me what I should have done." He opened the gate. They sat in the kitchen again. She walked him through what she'd found, the clusters, the stores, the temperature records she'd kept, the ventilation adjustments she'd made. She was methodical about it, the way she was methodical about everything. And he listened the way he'd found himself listening to her, not waiting for a pause to speak, actually listening. "You're not asking if it was your fault," he said when she finished. "I know it wasn't entirely my fault," she said. "I know I made the best decisions I had information for, but knowing that up here," she pressed 2 fingers to her temple, "and feeling it are 2 different operations." He looked at her. "The neighbor who said that," he said. "Peterson?" "Yes, he lost 4 hives his 2nd winter," Tate said. "And he'd been keeping bees his whole life." She was quiet for a moment. She wasn't receiving this as comfort exactly. She was filing it, weighting it, taking it seriously. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "I mean it. I don't need it to be fine, I just needed someone to..." She looked for the word. "Sit with it for a minute, without fixing it." He sat with it. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then he said, "My wife's name was Laurel." He hadn't said her name aloud in over a year. It came out careful and slightly strange, like a word in a language he was relearning. Phoebe went very still. Not in a way that said she was uncomfortable, in the way of someone who understood they'd been given something real and was being careful with it. "She died 4 years ago," he said. "March. She was 31. He turned his coffee cup once. "Leukemia. We had 11 months from diagnosis." He didn't know why he said it. He hadn't planned to. He'd spent 4 years not saying it, or saying only the flat facts of it when he had to, and even then as briefly as possible. "I'm sorry," Phoebe said. She said it simply, without the particular inflation sometimes gave those words. "The reason I'm saying it," he said, and then stopped, because he actually wasn't sure of the reason. He tried again. "I stopped talking to people because..." He shook his head. "I told myself it was practical. That I had a ranch to run. That I didn't have the capacity for anything beyond what was necessary." She waited. "I think," he said slowly, "I was just afraid that talking to people meant having to be somewhere she wasn't. That grief was the last place I had her." The kitchen was quiet. "I understand that," Phoebe said. "Do you?" She looked at her hands. "I was with someone for 3 years. He wasn't sick, he just." She took a breath. "He needed more from me than I knew how to give. And I made myself smaller and smaller trying to give it. And one day I looked in a mirror and I didn't know who I was looking at." A pause. "That's different from what you lost. I know that. But I understand the thing where you stop talking because the talking itself feels like it costs too much." He looked at her across the kitchen table. Outside the window, the snow was just starting, light and dry, the first real snow of the winter sifting down across the paddock. "What happened to him?" he said. "He's in Portland," she said. "He's fine. He found someone better suited to what he needed." She said it without bitterness. "I think what I needed was this. Land, bees, something that asked plainly what I could give and didn't need more than that." He nodded. She looked at the snow. "Do you think grief and hiding are the same thing?" she said. "For you?" The question landed clean and direct, the way her questions always did. Not aggressive, not prying, just precise. He thought about it honestly. "Not at the beginning," he said. "At the beginning it was just grief. Somewhere in the second year they got tangled up together, and I stopped being able to find the seam." She nodded slowly. "That's honest," she said. "You asked an honest question." Something shifted in her face, subtle, a small softening that was gone before it fully arrived. They sat in the kitchen for another hour. They talked about his cattle and her remaining 2 hives and what the winter was going to do to both. They talked about Dell and his uncanny ability to predict weather 3 days out. They talked about a book she was reading about grassland ecology that she thought was wrong in a specific chapter, and she explained why with the precision of a former biology teacher who had strong opinions about secondary sources. When she left, the snow had thickened, and the light had gone gray. He stood at the window and watched her truck reach the road. He thought, "I have told exactly one person about the seam between grief and hiding, and that person knocked on a gate." He didn't know what to do with that. So he went to bed and thought about it for 2 hours before he slept. January on the eastern Montana plains was not a season that accommodated anything but essentials. The cold came with a directness that had no patience for complication. You moved the cattle, checked the water lines, kept the heat alive, slept, got up, did it again. Phoebe Crane did not slow down in January. Tate knew this because Dell mentioned it once. With the particular tone of a man who is reporting something admirable while pretending to be neutral about it, and because he drove past her access road twice during supply runs and saw, both times, boot tracks in the snow leading from the house to the barn and back fresh enough to mean she'd been out that morning. She came once in January to help look at the shared fence line after a hard wind brought down 3 posts. She brought her own tools and worked beside him for 2 hours without being asked to stay for the second section. She stayed because the second section needed doing, and it was her fence too, and she didn't comment on this because it wasn't worth commenting on. Afterward, standing by the truck's faces red from the cold, she said, "You're different from what people said you were." He looked at her. "I mean," she paused. "They weren't wrong about the facts. You're not easy to talk to." A beat. "But they had the reason wrong. What did they say the reason was?" "That you were cold," she said. "That you didn't care about people anymore." He was quiet. "You care enormously," she said. "You're just afraid of it." She said it the way she might say the soil pH was off. A fact, not a judgment. "I think you became an expert at keeping that from showing, and at some point the expertise became the whole of the presentation." He stood in the January wind with this woman who had just said the most accurate thing anyone had said about him in 4 years, and he didn't respond immediately, because he couldn't find a response that was honest and also manageable. "You're not afraid of much, are you?" he finally said. "I'm afraid of quite a lot," she said. "I'm afraid of the electrical panel. I'm afraid the other 2 hives won't make it to spring. I'm afraid I made a big, irreversible decision and I might be wrong." She looked at him. "But I'm not afraid of saying what I think to someone who I think can hear it." He held her gaze. "Can I?" "I think so," she said. "I think you hear a lot. I think you've just gotten very good at not responding to most of it." She got in her truck. He stood in the road watching her go, and Dell, who had materialized from somewhere to collect the fence tools, said nothing at all, which was its own kind of sentence. February. They had a pattern by then, neither of them naming it. He drove by her place on his way back from the east pasture twice a week. This had begun as a single thing, checking that the access road was passable after a snow event and had continued as a habit. She was usually visible from the road, either in the yard or moving between the barn and the house, and she raised a hand when she saw his truck, and he raised one back, and that was usually all. But twice in February he'd stopped, and both times the stopping had expanded into an hour in her kitchen, or walking the perimeter of her property, looking at where she planned to expand the hive yard in spring, or standing in her barn while she showed him the overwintering setup she'd constructed for the remaining colonies. She had bookshelves in every room that had space for them. Practical books mostly: soil science, apiary management, building repair, emergency medicine, regional plant guides, but also novels and biographies stacked sideways on top of upright rows in the way of someone who had more books than architecture. On a Wednesday evening, he drove by in the last light and saw her lamplight in the window, and stopped without meaning to, and walked up to the door and knocked. She opened it with a book in her hand and a mildly questioning expression that shifted into something easier. "I was in the area," he said. She stepped back to let him in. "I know you were," she said. "You're always in the area on Wednesdays." He walked in. She made tea. He sat at her kitchen table and looked around the house, which had become a different house from the one she'd described in October. Not finished, but alive with the process of being worked on, walls half repainted, a new section of flooring that was clearly her own handiwork, a window seat she'd built and not yet cushioned. "You built that," he said, nodding at the window seat. "Bad cut on the left join," she said, handing him his tea, "but it's solid." He looked at the join. It was fine. "It's straight," he said. "The cut is off," she said, sitting down. "You're being nice." "I'm not nice," he said. It came out slightly more startled than he intended. She almost smiled. "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't believe the window seat compliment." He looked at her. She looked back. "You could fix the join," he said. "It's a 10-minute repair." "I know," she said. "I'm going to. I just got tired that day and stopped before I should have." She turned her teacup. "Do you ever do that?" "Stop before you should have." He thought about it. "I stopped talking to people," he said. "I stopped a lot of things before I should have." She absorbed that. Didn't rush past it or smooth it over. "What made you stop?" she said. Not for the first time. They'd circled this before, but the question had a different quality tonight, more specific, like she was asking about a particular mechanism rather than the general fact. "There's a thing that happens," he said, "when you're the person responsible for keeping everything moving." After Laurel died, the ranch still needed running. The men still needed managing. The cattle didn't know to wait. He paused. "I discovered that if I stayed in the operational frame, task, problem, solution, next task, I could get through a day, and then a week, and then a year, and then 4 years, she said quietly. "And then 4 years, he said. "What happens when you stop staying in the operational frame?" she said. He looked at his tea. "I don't know anymore," he said. "That's the honest answer. I stayed in it long enough that I don't have a clear memory of what it felt like to be outside it." She was quiet for a long moment. The lamp on the table between them made a soft light in the kitchen, and outside the February dark was complete and still. "I think you're outside it right now," she said. He looked up. "A little," she said. "Tonight, these evenings we keep having." She wasn't asking him to confirm it. She was just saying what she saw. He sat with that. Then he said, "Phoebe." She looked at him. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I want to be clear that I know I don't know how." She nodded slowly. "Do what?" He gestured between them, at the kitchen, at the lamplight, at the whole accumulated weight of the past 3 months. "Whatever this is becoming," he said. I don't know the moves. I did this once with Laurel, and we grew up together, and it was gradual, and I never had to learn it in my 30s. He paused. "I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know what you're dealing with." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not looking for someone who knows the moves." He waited. "I spent 3 years with someone who knew the moves," she said. He had a language for everything. He could name every stage of a relationship and what came next and what it meant. She looked at her cup. And none of it was real. The naming was the relationship. There was nothing underneath. A pause. "I'd rather have someone who tells me honestly that he doesn't know what he's doing and then shows up anyway." He looked at her for a long time. "That's what I can offer," he said. "I know," she said. He drove home in the dark, and the stars over the eastern Montana flats were so bright and dense they looked painted. and he drove the whole 12 miles without the radio, which was not unusual, but the quality of the silence was different than it had been in 4 years. Not empty. Something else. Something that had the texture of a beginning. Spring came in the way Montana spring came, reluctant, then sudden, with 2 feet of late snowfall in March that kept everyone housebound for 4 days, and then a week of warmth that hit like an argument won. Phoebe's hives came through, both of them. She sent him a text that said only, "They made it." He read it in the truck and sat there for a moment and then typed back, "Good," then deleted it and typed, "That's good news. I'll come by this week." Then sent it before he could manage it down to something shorter. She texted back a single bee emoji. He showed it to no one. But he was in a noticeably better mood that afternoon, and Dell, who noticed things, let it be. What he hadn't seen coming was Renata. Tate's sister-in-law arrived in April without significant warning. A text 2 days before that said she was passing through and would stop by, which in Renata's language meant she was coming with a purpose and wanted to see for herself. Renata Morrow was 42 and had loved Laurel like a sister, because Laurel had been her brother's wife, and that was that. In the years after, she had maintained contact with Tate through the particular persistence of a woman who had decided that someone was worth not giving up on, regardless of how many unreturned calls it took. She called once a week. He called back once a month, and she accepted this as the deal available to her and took it. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon and walked through his kitchen with the quick assessment of someone checking on a long-running situation, and was visibly surprised by what she found, or didn't find. The kitchen was clean. There were fresh groceries. There was a book on the counter, open face down, that she picked up and read the spine of with an expression she did not manage quickly enough. "Practical beekeeping in northern climates," she said. He came in from the yard. "Renata." She held up the book. He said nothing. She sat down at his table and looked at him for a long moment. "You look," she said carefully, "less terrible than you have in a while." "Thank you," he said. "Tell me about the book." He made coffee. He told her about the flat tire in October, the jack, the coffee, the fence line, the February evenings. He told her the way he told things, without embellishment, in the order they happened, leaving out nothing important. She listened with the stillness of someone who was aware they were receiving something significant and didn't want to disrupt it. When he finished, she said, "Have you told her any of this?" "What you just told me." "Some of it," he said. "Does she know you're—" Renata stopped, chose words. "Does she know where this is going for you?" "I don't know where it's going," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Tate, yes you do." He was quiet. "She's not Laurel," Renata said. And the way she said it was careful, not diminishing, just true. "You know that. I know that." "And you're not 24, she said. "I'm aware of my age." "What I mean," she said, "is that you have less time for the long way around than you did then. Less runway for waiting to see. If this matters to you, and I can see that it does, I've been looking at your face for 3 minutes. Don't be so careful that you miss it." He looked at his coffee. "She sounds like someone who can hear a direct thing," Renata said. "So say the direct thing." After Renata left, he sat in the kitchen for a long time. He thought about what Renata had said. He thought about what Phoebe had said on a February evening about a man who had the moves and nothing underneath them. He thought about what he actually had to offer, which was not much in the way of performance, not much in the way of ease, but was real, and was his, and had survived 4 years of being deliberately locked away, and was apparently still there. He was still thinking when he drove to her place the following evening. She was in the hive yard when he pulled in, spring suit, veil, smoker going. She raised a hand. He walked over to the fence and waited. She finished what she was doing with the calm, methodical attention she brought to everything, then closed up the hive and came to the fence and pulled off her veil. "How are they?" he said. "Strong," she said. "Queen in hive 2 is laying well. First nectar flow should start in another week or 2 if the weather holds." She looked at him. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he said. She waited, because Phoebe Crane was a woman who understood that some sentences needed a longer runway than others. "My sister-in-law was here yesterday," he said. "She said something that I've been—" He stopped. Started again. "I've been careful with you," he said. "Because I thought careful was what the situation asked for." "It was," she said. "It's stopping being," he said. "That's what I'm trying to say." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to pretend I know what this looks like going forward," he said. "I genuinely don't. I don't have a plan. I don't have a speech." He paused. But I know that the best part of my week, every week since October, has been however much time I spent in your company. And I know that I have spent 4 years building very good reasons why nothing could be worth the risk of caring about it. And I'm not interested in adding you to that list. The hive yard was quiet around them. The bees were moving in the warm afternoon air, the low, steady hum of a working colony, purposeful and unhurried. Phoebe looked at him for a long moment. She didn't rush to respond. She was thinking honestly, the way she thought about everything. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me. I made a decision about this a while ago," she said. "About you, about whether I was going to let this matter to me." She paused. "I decided yes. In January, if you need the specific month," something almost wry in her voice. "I've just been waiting to see if you'd get there too." He looked at her. "January," he said. "The fence line," she said. "When you told me I was right and didn't make a thing of it. Most men would have made a thing of it." She shrugged once. "I thought, this is someone worth waiting on." He stood at her fence in the April afternoon with this woman who had been quietly carrying a decision about him since January while he'd been laboriously working his way toward his own, and he felt something shift that had been rigid for a very long time. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just movement where there had been 4 years of stillness. "I'm not an easy man," he said. "I'm not an easy woman," she said. "I have opinions about secondary sources, and I keep bees, and I built a window seat with a bad join, and I left a stable career to move to a cold patch of land I inherited from my grandfather." She met his eyes. "I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for real." He opened the fence gate. She stood there in her beekeeper's suit with her veil in her hands and looked at him. "Okay," he said. She almost laughed, almost. The corner of her mouth moved. "Okay? I mean yes," he said. "That came out wrong. No," she said. And now she did laugh, quiet and genuine, the laugh of a person who has given up managing it. "It came out right. It came out like you." He looked at her and he thought, 4 years. 4 years of a house that was large and quiet and sufficient, and nothing more. And a woman knocked on a gate, and the whole locked architecture of that life turned out to be waiting for exactly that. He walked through the gate. They stood in the hive yard with the bees moving around them in the warm spring air, and he took her hand. Her hand that had worked this ground all winter and built a window seat with a bad join and set out hives in frozen October and knew exactly how to hand a man the right tool without being asked, and she held it like a person who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was finally simply putting it down. Summer came. The hive yard expanded. The cattle moved through their seasonal pastures. 2 people ate breakfast together most mornings at his kitchen table and supper most evenings at hers. And the 12 miles between their 2 places became something navigated so habitually that his truck knew the road without being driven. Del Stokes, 7 years working for Tate Morrow, came in from the South Range one August afternoon to find them at the kitchen table with coffee and seed catalogs and an argument in progress about whether the East Paddock could sustain a small colony placement in the spring. Tate was saying no on soil grounds. Phoebe was saying yes on forage grounds. Both of them were enjoying it enormously without appearing to notice that they were. Del poured himself coffee and sat in the corner and said nothing. Afterward, when Phoebe had gone home and the evening had settled, Del said to Tate, without looking up from the equipment log he was going through, "She's right about the paddock." "I know she's right about the paddock," Tate said. Del made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You're going to tell me something," Tate said. "Nope," Del said. "Already told you everything I've got to say on the subject." He closed the log. "You figured the rest out yourself." Tate stood at the kitchen window. Outside, the August evening was going gold over the hills, the particular gold that only happened in August in Montana, warm and slightly unreal, like the land was deciding to be beautiful on purpose. He thought about a woman who'd knocked on a gate with a practical problem and a clear-eyed request, and no pretense about any of it. He thought about the months between then and now, the slow, honest, unglamorous work of 2 people choosing to stop being alone, one careful conversation at a time. He thought about the electrical panel she'd finally had a professional look at, and the window seat join she'd fixed on a Sunday afternoon while he held the piece and she drove the screws, and the 2 hives that had come through a Montana winter on the strength of her preparation, and her care, and her stubborn willingness to learn what she didn't know. He thought about what it meant that the house he'd lived in alone for 4 years felt now like a house that was waiting for something to arrive every time she wasn't in it. He didn't think of himself as a man who had changed. He thought of himself as a man who had been returned to something. Like a field that had been left bare for years and was not barren, had never been barren, was simply waiting for someone to have the patience to work it. She had worked it, not by being brilliant or perfect or precisely what he needed. By being exactly who she was consistently, without apology, until being exactly who she was had made the whole locked-up, careful structure of his silence unnecessary. That was the whole of it. And on a late August evening, standing at the window while the gold faded off the hills, and the first of the night came in, Tate Morrow understood, simply, plainly, without anything left to argue about, that the woman 12 miles north with her bees and her opinion about secondary sources, and her bad window seat join, and her grandmother's rocking chair, was the person he intended to spend the rest of his life being honest with. He drove to her place. She was on the porch when he pulled in, the way she sometimes was in the evenings, watching the dark come. She looked at his truck, looked at him when he got out. He walked up to the porch. "I have something to say," he said. She waited. It wasn't a speech. He was not a speech man, and she knew that, and what he said was plain and direct and cost him something real, the way the things that matter always do. She listened, and when he was done she was quiet for a moment, the careful quiet of a woman receiving something she had hoped for and was now taking seriously. "Yes," she said, simply, obviously yes. He looked at her. "I've been saying yes since January," she said. "You're only just catching up." He laughed, actually laughed. It came out surprising him slightly, the way laughter does when a man has been a long time without it. She smiled. And on the porch of the house her grandfather had built, in the last light of an August evening, that was how it ended, and how it began. With two people who had each survived something that had tried to make them smaller, finding that the other person's presence made them more entirely themselves, which is the only kind of love that lasts.